I'm Beverly Myrtle Nicol, and I lived in 34th and Harriet as a child and at 34th and Pleasant after I was married. I married Ken Nicol at Incarnation on the 5th of June, 1941. And we had to be married in the priest's house because Kenneth wasn't a Catholic at that time. He joined the church later, however. We had 4 sons, and they went to Incarnation also. When I went to Incarnation, we didn't have a kindergarten, so I had to go to Lindale School for that. And then I was out of school for half a year because of some illness, whatever it was. And then I came to Incarnation in January. In those days, we had January classes. And so when I went there, I graduated in January with a class of 13. We graduated from the basement of the church, which was the big place to go for anything like a stage or anything. And eventually they did get a kindergarten because there was an old brown house on that other corner, and they opened that up as a kindergarten. When I went to the school, whenever we went outside, we had a nice playground with some swings in it. And the boys all played baseball, and eventually the girls entered in. But as we came out of school, we always had to march down the hall and down the stairs where there was an old phonograph, and it played all these marches, and we marched out. And we weren't allowed to speak until we got outside. I also remember that in 8th grade, because none of the nuns could go anywhere alone, Sister Dola asked me to come with her every Friday. So we went over to the church, and I waited in the front pew while she made the altar ready for the Sunday Masses. And speaking of Sunday Masses, we had many, many Masses because the church was very full. And eventually, they cut up the parish, and we had Visitation and Joan of Arc and St. Leonard's. So we had 4 and 6 Masses a Sunday. And I became very good friends with Father Moynihan, the first Moynihan. At the time, I became president of Women's Club, and I was the youngest president they ever had. I was only 30. And he came to my first meeting, and I asked him to be guest of honor and to tell us about his trip to Europe. And when he talked about being in Europe, he mentioned how they didn't eat supper until 10 o'clock. And when he was all through, I got up and in all my innocence said, if you remember Cedric Adams, I got up and said, well, I could never go to Europe like that because I always go to bed with Cedric Adams. And everybody gasped, and I turned and looked at him, and I went, ah. And he threw his head back, and he laughed so hard I thought he was going to fall off the chair. And I was teased about that for a year. And then after that, he had been talking to me about his book. And so I offered to type it up for him. So I typed his book. And when it was printed, the very first book he picked out and came down to give to me because we became such fine friends over that book. And I was so pleased, and he wrote in the front space about giving it to me. And then there were many people in the parish who didn't buy the book, but they wanted to borrow mine. And I never got it back.
Oh, no.
It was all about Archbishop Ireland. And it was a very, very well-written book, of course. So, and I was very active in church, as was my husband. Ken was in ushers, and he was secretary of Holy Name, and he was in KC's, and I was, besides Women's Club, I was on the very first parish council, and I lived through a lot of changes, and I was also on the first Eucharistic ministers, and I had charge of the Eucharistic ministers, and So we never knew what Mass we were going to go to because somebody always had to change. And then I lived through such changes as the priest always had his back to us when he said Mass. And I lived through the change where he turned, and I can remember the first time he turned and I thought, gee, I hope he can keep his mind on it now that he's watching the rest of us. And some of the new things, like we used to kneel down at the railing for communion. We used to lift our mouths open to have communion. And it was such a relief to be able to stand and to take the communion in our hands. And that was awesome, the first time I took the communion in my hands. And eventually, being a Eucharistic minister, I got a little more used to it. And I remember being terribly embarrassed when we had Holy Thursday, and Father insisted that all of the council members sit in chairs by the altar and have our. And oh, what wonderful priests we had! Just really great priests, and lots of good friends. And I still play bridge with some of them. Well, I remember way back into Father Abbott, who was one of the first ones, and Father Sheehy. And Father Sheehy, everyone just loved to go to confession when he was there in the confessional because you could hear him all over the church. He always gave the same penance to everyone. 5 Our Fathers and 5 Hail Marys. And he said it like that. And the saying was that if a murderer came in, he'd still get 5 Our Fathers and 5 Hail Marys. And there were really wonderful priests there. I remember when my dad was a lead singer, tenor in the beginning, but then, you know, we didn't do any singing. And when they finally said we could do singing, Father Packard stood up there and directed us because we were all wavery and afraid, and finally we sang more respectably. And things like Holy Week, my dad would sing the part of Christ on the cross, and Mr. Coffey, who was not a tenor but was a baritone, would answer him as the thief who stole heaven. And Mrs. Herman sang as Mary. And I would sit there and be so proud of my dad. And then also they sang Tenebrae. And the bad thing is that one of the things that they used to put on, they put on a minstrel show, and they all blackened their faces. And my dad was a railroad man, and some of his friends were porters. And when he talked about it, the porters told him how that hurt. And so my dad got them to stop doing that. They didn't do that anymore. And I was proud of him then too. Thinking it came right along with Pope John the 23rd. And Father Packard, he was a very gifted singer, and and I remember asking him once, a couple times after we'd been practicing, I asked him why it is that I always feel so much better singing the song that we exit from church, and he said that's because you're supposed to go out and spread the news. And I can remember that very well. I also remember my sons were altar boys, and speaking of Father Packard, it brings back the memory. The first time one of my sons was going to be an altar boy, they had to ask him, and he wasn't ready yet, but they were short, and they made the mistake of giving him the bells. And he didn't know exactly when he was supposed to ring the bells. And I'm sitting in the front pew, and the first time he rang them the wrong time, I thought, well, now I have to make him feel better. However, from then on, every time Father Packard genuflected or moved his arms, he rang the bells. and when we got out, Father met us outside, and he said, I literally was afraid to clear my throat. But then he got trained.